Hello students, welcome back once again to my YouTube class. Students, in our previous class we have learned a little portion regarding reproduction in plants. In our previous class you all have learned the types of reproduction as asexual and sexual, and under asexual mode of reproduction you have also learned the different modes of reproduction, that is budding, fragmentation, spore formation and vegetative reproduction. Today in this class we will learn the other type of reproduction, that is sexual reproduction. Students, what happens during sexual reproduction is that an individual takes the help of another individual to produce copies of themselves or to reproduce its young ones. Especially as we are going to learn the reproduction in plants, so sexual reproduction in plants takes place when a male cell produced by the male part of the flower fuses with the female cell which is produced by the female part of the flower. What happens? The male and the female cell is able to undergo reproduction, okay, by the fusion. And after the fusion of the male and the female cell, what happens is that fertilization takes place. So fertilization is nothing but the process of fusion of the male and the female cell. The male cell and the female cell can also be called as gametes. The male cell and the female cell which is produced by the flower or the part of the flower, okay, is also called as gametes. So when the fusion of the male and the female gametes takes place, the process is known as fertilization, and after the fertilization what happens is that it leads to the formation of a single cell. When the male and the female cell undergo fusion, they lead to the formation of a single cell known as zygote, okay, and this zygote, it divides and redivides slowly to give rise to a new individual plant. So in this way sexual reproduction takes place in case of the plants. Now let us recall some of the things that you have learnt in your previous class, that is the parts of a flower. We have learned that a flower has got 4 whorls, and we have also learned that all the flowers do not have the 4 whorls. Some flowers have 3 and some flowers have got 4 whorls. Okay, so the flower which has got 3 whorls, it either lacks stamens or carpels, that is the male part of the flower or the female part of the flower. So whenever we find a flower, okay, which has got only 3 whorls, it may either have the male part of the flower as stamens or the female part of the flower as carpels. So such a flower which do not have all the 4 whorls, they are called as incomplete flowers or unisexual flowers. But the flower which has got all the 4 whorls, they are called as complete flowers or bisexual flowers. So let me give you some of the examples of unisexual flowers. You might have seen plants like cucumber, bitter gourd, okay, bottle gourd, pumpkin and all. Such plants, they use to bear flowers, and the flowers of such plants, okay, always lacks one of the whorl. So such a flowers, as it lacks one of the whorl, it may either have the male part of the flower or the female part of the flower as stamens and carpels. So such flowers of plants like pumpkin, bitter gourd, bottle gourd, okay, they are called as unisexual or incomplete flowers. But the flowers of those plants, okay, which has got all the 4 whorls, they are of gulmohar, rose, lily and china rose, okay, they are called as complete or bisexual flowers as it has got all the 4 whorls. It consists of both the male and the female part in one flower along with the other 2 whorls. So students, as you have learnt regarding the fertilization, you have learned that the fusion of the male and the female gamete is known as fertilization. So how this fusion of the male and the female cell of the plant takes place? The male cell and the female comes togetherly. It is only because of a process known as pollination. So what is pollination? Pollination is the transference of pollen from the anther to the stigma. Okay, and the process called pollination is carried out by insects and birds. We often see birds and insects happen to sit on the flowers to suck the nectar of the flowers. So whenever they happen to sit on the flowers, what happens is that some of the pollen grains get sticks on the body of the insect or the birds, and when they move from one flower to other flower, the pollen grain gets dropped from one flower to the other flower. In this way, the pollen grains gets transferred. So the pollination is nothing but is the transference of pollen from the anther to the stigma, and because of the transference of pollen from the anther to the stigma, what happens? The fusion of the male and the female cell takes place, which is known as fertilization. And after the fertilization, you have learned what happens. It leads to the formation of a single cell known as zygote, and the zygote divides and redivides slowly and slowly to give rise to a new individual plant. In this way, the reproduction is carried out. But if we talk about the pollination once again, then we find that pollination is again of two different types. The first type of pollination is known as self-pollination. Okay, let us learn about self-pollination first. The pollination or the transference of pollen that takes place from the anther, okay, to the stigma of the same flower. The transference of pollen that takes place from the anther to the stigma of the same flower is known as self-pollination. Self-pollination is always carried out in case of bisexual flowers. As I have given you the examples of bisexual flowers, that means flowers of gulmohar, rose, lily and all. Okay, such flowers are known as bisexual because it has got all the four whorls, both the whorls in it along with the two whorls. Okay, so they are always able to undergo self-pollination. And the other type of pollination is cross-pollination. So in cross-pollination, what happens is that the transference of pollen takes place from the anther to the stigma of different flowers of the same kind of plant. Okay, we can see here the transference of pollens that takes place from the stamens of one flower to the pistil of another flower. That means the pollen is carried out from the stamen of one flower to the pistil of another flower of the same kind of plant. So you might have seen the bitter gourd plant, you might have seen the cucumber plant or the pumpkin plant. Whenever it grows up, what happens? It happens to bear many flowers at a time. So all the flowers, it doesn't mean that they have got but the male part and the female part togetherly. We have learned that this pumpkin, bitter gourd, cucumber, such plants always bears unisexual flowers. So it lacks either stamens or carpels. So what happens is that in such flowers, what we find is that cross-pollination takes place. Okay, the pollen is transferred from the stamens of one flower to the pistil of another flower of the same kind of plant. Cross-pollination is much more common than self-pollination. Okay, we find most of the plants undergoes cross-pollination than self-pollination. All unisexual flowers are cross-pollinated. That means those flowers which are unisexual, that means it has got only the male part or the female part, either of the male and the female parts. Okay, it always undergoes cross-pollination. We have learned regarding the pollination. Now we are going to learn about how fertilization takes place. We have learned what is fertilization. The fusion of the male and the female cell is known as fertilization. And after the fertilization, what happens? We have already learned. But how this fertilization takes place? We have understood regarding the fusion of the male and the female cell. So what happens during fertilization is that the pollen is carried out from the anther to the stigma. So when the pollen is carried out or transferred from the anther to the stigma, what happens? The pollen grain, it germinates and grows along a thin tube known as pollen tube. Okay, this pollen tube, okay, then carries the male gamete, that is the male cell produced by the pollen grain, and it is again pushed through the style into the ovary of the plant flower. Okay, the male gamete then enters an ovule, and inside the ovule, what we find? We find the female gamete or the female cell or egg, we can call. After it gets the female egg or the female cell, what happens? The male and the female undergoes fusion, and after undergoing fusion, what happens? The ovary, it develops into a fruit, and the ovule, it develops into a seed. In this way, fertilization occurs in case of the flowers. Okay, my dear students, hope you have understood regarding the topic sexual reproduction. Now we are going to discuss another topic under this chapter, that is dispersal of seeds. We know that different plants are reproduced in different ways. All the plants do not bear seeds. So all those plants, we are going to discuss about those plants which bear seeds. Why it is so important for the plants to have dispersal of seeds? We know that the seeds, in order to germinate or in order to grow into a new plant, it requires favorable conditions like food, air and nutrients. Okay, so if the seed happens to grow along with the parent plant, then what will happen? It will lead to a shortage of nutrients for the parent plant, as lack of minerals or light and so on, and many of the plants may die. That is why dispersal of seeds has become very important for the plants to grow into a new individual plant. So the scattering or dispersal of seeds, or the separation of seeds from the parent plant, okay, it takes place in many different ways. Let me tell you one by one. The first way is by the wind. How these seeds are dispersed by the wind? We know plants, some of the plants, they bear seeds that are very light in weight. Okay, you might have seen the cotton seeds, silk cotton, devil's tree. Okay, such seeds have tufts of hair which helps them to ride on the wind. That is why the seeds of such plants are dispersed by wind very easily. Okay, the second way for dispersal of seeds is by water. If you have coconut plant in your house, or you might have seen coconut sometimes when your parents have brought it at home, this coconut has got a fibrous covering at the outer portion of it, and because of the fibrous covering, okay, which we use to make coir, okay, it helps it to float in water. This coconut is easily able to float in water because of the fibrous covering, and can be carried out far away from the parent plant. And the seeds of lotus, water chestnuts, they are also easily getting dispersed, or they easily get dispersed by the water, as they have spongy covering to help them float. Okay, so in this way, some of the plants like coconut or water chestnuts, lotus and all, their seeds gets dispersed very easily by water. And the other third way that helps to the dispersal of seeds is by animals. Many animals have got furs on their body. Okay, so because of having furs on their body, the animals are not only able to have warmth during winter season, but they also help in the reproduction of the plants in some ways. We know the furs present in the body of the animals, okay, sometimes at the time of searching food, what happens, some of the seeds as it has got some hook like things in their body, have spines and hooks. Having spines and hooks on the seeds, it gets sticked on the furs of the animals, and these animals, when they move from that very place to a different place, the hooks or the spines having on the seeds, it gets separated out very easily, and the seed gets dispersed from the parent plant, and getting favorable conditions like air, water, nutrients and all, the seed grows into an individual plant. And the last way for dispersal of seeds is by exploding fruits. We know different plants bears different varieties of fruits, so some of the fruits gets dispersed very easily after the exploding of the fruits. If I give you some of the examples, then you might have seen cotton plants, you might have seen rubber tree, balsam, night jasmine. Okay, all these plants, when the fruits of such plants, when they get ripened, the explosion of the fruits takes place, and after the bursting of the fruits, what happens? The seed gets scattered away from the parent plant very easily. The seeds of rubber tree, okay, after the bursting of its seeds, what happens is that the seed gets scattered from the parent plant at a distance of 10 to 12 meter away from the parent plant. In this way, the seeds gets dispersed due to various ways, as I've told you, by wind, by water, by animals, and by exploding of fruits. Students, the class gets over with this topic. If you have any queries or doubts after listening the discussion of this class, you can call me every night between 8 to 10. I shall try to clarify your doubts. With this, I wrap my class. Thank you. Have a nice day.